Anytime scientists work in the lab, they need to use equipment both correctly and safely. Some of the different types of equipment are used for holding and mixing chemicals, some are used for measurement, and others are used to heat liquids. The first piece of equipment is a test tube that is used for both mixing or heating small quantities of chemicals. Scientists can also use a chem plate. A chem plate is similar to a test tube as it can also be heated and holds liquids. However, it holds much smaller amounts of liquids. Another piece of equipment is a test tube holder. A test tube holder is used to hold onto a test tube that is being mixed or heated. This holder specifically is used to hold the cylinder of a test tube so that you don't burn your hands as the test tube is getting hot. A test tube rack is used to hold and store all of the test tubes being used in a lab. A test tube rack is similar to a chem plate as it can hold many different types of liquids. The final tool used with test tubes is a test tube brush. The test tube brush can be inserted into the test tubes and used to clean them out. The next piece of equipment is a beaker. Beakers are used for heating and mixing chemicals. This is similar to a test tube, however, beakers can hold much more liquid. An Erlenmeyer flask is used for dissolving, mixing, and heating chemicals together just like a beaker. However, the difference is it's tapered at the top as it comes to a small opening, so that less air can get into the flask and react with any chemicals that might be inside. The next flask is what we call a Florence flask. Some will also call this a bubble flask. It has a round bottom and an extremely narrow neck. Also used for boiling, distilling chemicals, as well as mixing and heating. The last piece of glass is the graduated cylinder. This is not used for heating or mixing. Instead, the graduated cylinder is used for very precise measurement of a liquid. It has markings allowing us to get a very accurate read of how much liquid is found inside of that graduated cylinder. The next two pieces of equipment are very similar. One is an eyedropper and the other is a pipette. A dropper or eyedropper is used to measure drops of a liquid. Droppers are not very accurate as they just simply release one drop of liquid at a time. Pipettes, on the other hand, are used to measure specific amounts of liquid. A pipette is used to pull out perhaps 5 milliliters of a solution, and then it can move 5 milliliters to something else. Pipettes are used for specific measurements, whereas eyedroppers are just moving or counting number of drops. A rubber stopper typically goes on top of a test tube or different types of flasks. These are used to prevent any air from getting in or out of these pieces of equipment. Stoppers can also have holes on the top of them to connect tubes to other types of equipment. So for example, if I am trying to capture some gas from one, I would have a tube that could connect to a different piece of equipment. The next piece we're looking at is a funnel. A funnel is used to transfer liquids from one spot to another. It is really used to help prevent spills. If you are trying to use a funnel to separate out solids and liquids, you're going to need to use something called filter paper. Filter paper will go inside of the funnel and it will allow you to separate out solids and liquids as you pour the material through the filter paper and funnel. Continuing on, we have a stirring rod, which is typically made up of glass and used to stir and mix chemicals together. Also pictured here is something called a scoopula. A scoopula can be used to stir, but it also is used to scoop out chemicals. The next two pieces we have is a petri dish and a watch glass. A petri dish and a watch glass, or also called a watch plate, are used to observe specimen or reactions. Typically, a petri dish will have sides and a lid, whereas a watch plate is simply a flat piece of glass. The next pieces of equipment you will definitely be using more in high school than you will be using in middle school. However, we'd like you to know what they are. First, we're looking at a ring stand. A ring stand is going to allow you to be more hands-free when using and heating things like a test tube or other chemicals. Next to the picture, you're going to see a ring stand holder or a ring stand clamp. You will also see wire gauze and a clay triangle. All of these objects go at the top of a ring stand and are then used to set things on top of. For example, you can set a beaker on top of the wire gauze, and you can then heat the beaker while being hands-free. Underneath a ring stand, you will typically place something called a Bunsen burner. A Bunsen burner will allow you to have flame and heat different materials. Next to the Bunsen burner is something called a striker or flint. The striker will create a spark, which allows you to ignite or start the Bunsen burner. As I said, we do not use these very often. We instead would use something called a hot plate. Instead of using open flame, it's a little bit safer and easier for us to use a hot plate. A hot plate looks a lot like a miniature stove, and it's used for heating things like a beaker or a flask. Pictured next to the hot plate is something called a hot mitt. We have different types of them. Some hot mitts go on like gloves or almost like an oven mitt to keep you from burning yourself, and other types are used for holding and moving and transporting glass. As you see, you'd put the hand inside and you're able to grab a beaker. If you're not using a hot mitt to move your hot glassware, you could also use tongs. Tongs are used to pick up a hot flask or a beaker and move it. Some of the tools you may use are a triple beam balance or a digital scale. Both of these are going to measure mass. A triple beam balance is not used as frequently as we now have technology that allows us to use a digital scale and get a digital reading of mass, and it is more accurate. We also have something called a spring scale that'll allow you to measure the force of things. We have thermometers, which is a tool to help you measure temperature or how warm or cold something is. And of course, all labs must have safety equipment, such as a fire extinguisher to put out any fires. Remember, when using a fire extinguisher, you would pull the pin, aim at the base of the flame, and then squeeze the nozzle. We also have something called a fire blanket. Fire blankets are used to put out clothing fires. So if a sleeve were to catch on fire, we would use the fire blanket to wrap it up. That way we don't have to spray harmful chemicals right on the skin. We wear safety goggles to protect our eyes and lab aprons to prevent any chemical spills. Occasionally, we may wear gloves. The final piece of equipment is an eye wash station. Most eye wash stations come with safety showers, and those are used when there's an emergency or a chemical spill. If you were to accidentally spill chemicals onto your body or into your eyes, you use the shower or the eye wash station to clean and rinse out.